You say we can't compete at this level. I'm here to prove you wrong." The room went silent. An unknown Filipino fighter had just called out one of Europe's greatest champions in front of the world. What happened next broke the internet and changed combat sports forever. At the center of the press table sat Magnus the Hammer Bergström, and his presence alone commanded the room. At 36 years old, this Swedish mixed martial arts legend was widely regarded as one of the greatest European fighters of his generation. His record spoke for itself. 68 professional fights, 62 victories, only 6 losses. 2 world championships adorned his legacy. His striking was considered surgical in its precision, his grappling technique flawless, and his conditioning seemingly inhuman. In Sweden and across Scandinavia, where combat sports had evolved into a source of intense national pride and cultural identity, Magnus Bergström was nothing short of royalty. His fights drew millions of viewers across television and streaming platforms. Young fighters throughout Europe studied his techniques and training methods with religious devotion, hoping to replicate even a fraction of his remarkable success. Beside Magnus sat his longtime coach, the highly respected Sven Andersson, who had trained multiple European champions over his distinguished 30-year career. Sven was considered one of the finest minds in Scandinavian martial arts, a tactician whose fight strategies had become textbook material in gyms across the continent. The other panelists were equally impressive. A Norwegian former champion who had retired with honor after years of legendary battles against Magnus himself. A Danish coach whose fighters had claimed numerous international titles across multiple weight divisions. And a Finnish technical director who oversaw Nordic MMA development and had authored several influential books on combat sports training methodology. In the audience, largely unnoticed among the crowd of European fighters and media, sat Carlos Reyes. The Filipino mixed martial arts fighter in his late 20s had determined eyes and scarred knuckles, the kind that only come from years of intense training and street-hardened experience. He wore a simple Philippines national team jacket, its colors bright against the sea of European fight gear surrounding him. Carlos had traveled from Manila with his small team on a shoestring budget, pooling resources from family, friends, and local gym sponsors who believed in him. While the European fighters stayed in luxury hotels near the venue, Carlos and his coach shared a modest hostel room several miles away, taking public transportation to save money. A Norwegian journalist stood up, directing his question to Magnus. "You're set to defend your title next month. There's been talk of expanding the championship to include more fighters from Asia. What are your thoughts on the level of competition from that region?" Magnus leaned forward to the microphone, his expression one of casual confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Look, I have tremendous respect for martial arts traditions in Asia," he began, his English accent thick with Swedish inflection. "But there's a significant difference between traditional martial arts and modern mixed martial arts at the championship level." He paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. "The infrastructure, the training facilities, the coaching expertise, the sports science, these things matter. In Scandinavia and Europe, we've invested decades building world-class systems. We have nutritionists, sports psychologists, strength and conditioning coaches, access to cutting-edge training technology." Then came the statement that would change everything. "Southeast Asian fighters, particularly from places like the Philippines, they have heart. I'll give them that. They're tough, no question. But tough doesn't win championships at this level. When you're talking about competing against fighters who have access to the best training in the world, who have been preparing their entire lives with every advantage. Let's just say I haven't seen anyone from that region who could realistically compete at this championship level. The gap in resources, in systematic training, in technical development, it's just too significant." A murmur rippled through the room. Several journalists scribbled furiously. Others exchanged knowing glances. Magnus seemed pleased with his analysis, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd stated an obvious truth. Sven Andersson nodded beside him. Magnus is being diplomatic, the coach added. The reality is even more stark. In our gym in Stockholm, our fighters train 6 to 8 hours daily with world-class specialists in every discipline. I just don't see that level of infrastructure existing in these developing regions. In the audience, Carlos Reyes felt his jaw tighten. His hands, resting on his knees, clenched into fists. His coach, Roberto Santos, a weathered Filipino trainer in his 50s who had developed fighters in Manila's toughest gyms for over 30 years, placed a steady hand on Carlos's shoulder. "Steady," Roberto whispered. "Let them underestimate you. That's an advantage." But Carlos couldn't stay silent. He stood, his movement drawing attention from the nearby journalists. A Norwegian reporter recognized him from the preliminary fight. Rowe handed him a microphone. "Mr. Bergström," Carlos said, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the room. The press conference moderator looked surprised but didn't object. "I'm Carlos Reyes from the Philippines. I'm fighting in the preliminary card of this championship." Magnus looked at him with casual interest, the way a lion might regard a mouse that had made a small noise. "I respect your achievements, sir. Your record speaks for itself," Carlos continued. "But with all due respect, I think you're making assumptions about fighters you've never faced, from places you've never trained." The room had gone completely quiet now. This was unexpected, a preliminary fighter challenging a legend publicly. "In the Philippines, we may not have fancy facilities with all the latest equipment," Carlos said, his voice growing stronger. "We train in gyms with cracked cement floors, under corrugated metal roofs in tropical heat that would make your climate-controlled training centers feel like vacation. We don't have teams of nutritionists. We have rice, fish, and vegetables that we prepare ourselves between training sessions." He took a breath, every eye in the room now fixed on him. "We don't have sports psychologists. We have discipline forged by necessity. Many of us don't have the luxury of being full-time fighters. We work jobs, support families, and then train when we can. Our strength and conditioning coach is often poverty itself, pushing us to be more resourceful, more determined, more hungry than fighters who have never questioned where their next meal comes from." Magnus's expression had shifted from casual interest to something harder. "You say we can't compete at this level," Carlos continued. "I'm here to prove you wrong. I know I'm just on the preliminary card, but I'm here to show that heart, determination, and a lifetime of fighting, really fighting, not just in a ring but for survival, for dignity, for our families. That means something." A journalist near the front filmed the entire exchange on his phone. Within hours, clips of both Magnus's dismissive comments and Carlos's impassioned response had spread across social media platforms. By that evening, the hashtag Prove Magnus Wrong was trending in the Philippines, across Southeast Asia, and gaining traction globally. Filipino communities worldwide shared the video. Immigrants in America, Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, people who had faced their own struggles, their own battles against being underestimated, found something deeply resonant in Carlos's words. This wasn't just about fighting anymore. It had become symbolic of a larger struggle. The Philippine Daily Inquirer ran the story on its front page. "Filipino fighter challenges Swedish champion's claims." International sports networks picked it up. MMA forums erupted in heated debates. Some European fans defended Magnus, arguing he was simply being realistic about training advantages. Others criticized him for arrogance and dismissing entire regions of fighters. But in the Philippines, the response was universal. Gyms across Manila, Cebu, Davao, from the most established training centers to the smallest neighborhood facilities, rallied behind Carlos. Fighters who had never met him felt personally invested in his success. The country, familiar with being overlooked and underestimated on the global stage, had found its champion. Carlos Reyes had not come from privilege. Born in Tondo, one of Manila's toughest neighborhoods, he had grown up in a two-room apartment that housed his parents, four siblings, and often extended family members who had nowhere else to go. His father had worked as a jeepney driver, navigating Manila's chaotic streets 14 hours a day. His mother sold fish in the local market, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. Violence was a fact of life in Tondo. Carlos had learned to fight not in a gym but in the streets, protecting his younger siblings from gangs, defending what little his family had from those who would take it. He had seen friends fall to drugs, to violence, to the grinding poverty that seemed to swallow futures whole. At 15, bloodied from a particularly brutal street fight, Carlos had stumbled into a small MMA gym run by Roberto Santos. The gym was nothing like the gleaming training centers Magnus Bergström knew. It occupied the ground floor of an old building, with equipment that was mostly second-hand, mats that were patched and repatched, and a heavy bag that had been repaired so many times it was more duct tape than leather. Roberto had seen something in the angry, desperate teenager. "You want to keep fighting in the streets," the coach had told him. "You'll end up dead or in prison. You want to fight with purpose, with discipline, you train here." For the next 12 years, that gym had been Carlos's second home. He had worked construction during the day, trained in the evenings, fought in local competitions on weekends. Every peso he earned went to supporting his family and funding his training. There had been no sponsors, no easy path, no guarantees. He had fought his way up through the brutal Southeast Asian circuit, fights in Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore. Places where the competition was fierce, the pay was minimal, and the only reward was the opportunity to fight again. His record was impressive: 24 wins, 3 losses, with victories over fighters who would go on to compete internationally. After the press conference went viral, the pressure on Carlos intensified exponentially. What had been scheduled as a preliminary bout, barely a footnote in the championship event, had transformed into something with far greater significance. The entire Philippines was watching. Southeast Asia was watching. The global Filipino diaspora was watching. Magnus Bergström, for his part, seemed unbothered by the attention. In interviews, he remained confident, though perhaps slightly more measured in his phrasing. "I respect Carlos's passion," he told a Swedish sports network. "But passion doesn't change the fundamental realities of elite-level competition. I stand by my assessment." Meanwhile, in Oslo, Carlos trained with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The Nordic Fighting Championship organization, recognizing the massive interest the story had generated, offered Carlos access to their training facilities, an unprecedented gesture for a preliminary card fighter. Roberto was cautious about accepting. "We train our way," he told Carlos. "We don't need their charity." But Carlos saw opportunity. "Coach, let me use their equipment. Let me learn everything I can. Then let's beat them with it." They trained twice daily. Morning sessions focused on technical work, drilling takedown defense, perfecting combinations, studying fight footage. Roberto had obtained videos of Magnus's last 10 fights, and they analyzed every pattern, every tendency, every micro-adjustment the Swedish champion made under different circumstances. Evenings were dedicated to conditioning and sparring. Carlos pushed himself to exhaustion and then pushed further. He ran through Oslo's cold streets at dawn, his breath creating clouds in the freezing air, so different from Manila's tropical heat, but he adapted. He embraced the discomfort, let it fuel him. The Norwegian and Danish fighters training at the same facility began to notice the Filipinos' dedication. Some were friendly, offering advice and occasionally sparring. Others were dismissive, echoing Magnus's sentiment that Carlos was out of his depth. "This isn't a street fight, mate," a Danish heavyweight told him after a sparring session. "This is elite-level competition. Different world." Carlos just nodded and kept training. The night of the event arrived with snow falling gently on Oslo. The Spectrum Arena was packed with over 10,000 fans. Norwegian and Swedish flags dominated the crowd, but scattered throughout were pockets of Filipino supporters, OFWs, overseas Filipino workers, who had traveled from across Norway, Sweden, and neighboring countries, carrying the Philippine flag and handmade signs supporting Carlos. Back in Manila, it was early morning. Despite the hour, sports bars across the city were packed. Families gathered around televisions in their homes. In Tondo, Carlos's entire neighborhood had set up a large screen in the street, with hundreds gathered to watch their hometown hero. The preliminary fights proceeded through the evening. Each bout built the energy in the arena, but everyone knew what the crowd was really waiting for: the main event, where Magnus Bergström would defend his championship. Carlos's bout was scheduled as the final preliminary fight, the featured prelim, elevated in importance due to the viral attention. His opponent was a respected Dutch fighter with a solid record, someone who had been on the cusp of title contention himself. When Carlos walked to the cage, the Filipino sections erupted. The chant began, "Pilay Pinas, Pilay Pinas." It echoed through the arena, passionate and defiant. Even some neutral fans, moved by the underdog story, joined in. Roberto Santos walked beside him, steady and calm. "Remember everything," the coach said simply. "Trust your training, fight your fight, not his." The bout itself was a war. The Dutch fighter was technically excellent, with crisp striking and solid grappling credentials. The first round was competitive, feeling each other out, both landing significant strikes. Carlos fought with controlled aggression, not the wild abandon of a desperate man, but the focused intensity of someone who had prepared perfectly. In the second round, Carlos began to implement the game plan. He mixed his attacks beautifully, punishing leg kicks that gradually slowed his opponent's movement, lightening fast hands that found openings in the Dutch fighter's defense, and when the opportunity presented, devastating takedowns that showcased grappling skills honed through years of training. By the third round, Carlos had taken control. His conditioning, forged through years of training in Manila's brutal heat, running through city streets, sparring session after session with no rest, proved superior. As his opponent tired, Carlos accelerated. The finish came midway through the round, a perfectly timed combination that dropped the Dutch fighter, followed by ground and pound that forced the referee to stop the bout. TKO, victory for Carlos Reyes. The Filipino sections of the crowd went absolutely wild. In Manila, the street celebration in Tondo began immediately, spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. Social media exploded with celebrations and praise. But Carlos, catching his breath in the octagon as his hand was raised, wasn't celebrating yet. His eyes went to the back area where Magnus Bergström was preparing for the main event. This victory, as sweet as it was, had been just a statement. The real message was still to come. After the fight, as Carlos was being examined by the medical staff, a championship official approached. "Mr. Reyes, if you're medically cleared and willing, Mr. Bergström has requested you be in the cage for his post-fight interview. He wants to address you directly." Carlos looked at Roberto, who nodded slowly. "Let's see what he has to say." Magnus's title defense was dominant, as expected. He dismantled his challenger methodically over 4 rounds before securing a submission. As the cage door opened after his victory, instead of his usual celebration, Magnus immediately called for a microphone. The crowd quieted, sensing something unusual. "Tonight I defended my title," Magnus began, still breathing hard from the fight. "And I did it the way I always do, with the best training, the best team, the best preparation." He paused, looking directly at the camera. "But I also watched Carlos Reyes fight tonight. I watched him do exactly what I said fighters from his region couldn't do: come here, step into this cage, and compete at a championship level." The crowd murmured with interest. "I was wrong," Magnus said, and the arena erupted. I made assumptions based on facilities and resources, and I forgot that fighting, real fighting, is about what's inside a person. It's about heart, discipline, will. Carlos showed all of that tonight. He gestured for Carlos to join him in the cage. Carlos, still in his fight shorts with his coach beside him, climbed through the ropes. The two fighters stood face to face. Magnus extended his hand. "You proved me wrong. I respect that. I respect you." Carlos shook his hand, the moment captured by dozens of cameras. "Thank you for the motivation," Carlos said simply, drawing laughter from the crowd. Then Magnus did something unexpected. "My title defense is done. I need a new challenge. Carlos Reyes, 3 months from now, if you want it, I'll give you a title shot. Let's see if you can do to me what you did tonight." The arena exploded. Carlos stood shocked. Roberto gripped his shoulder. This was beyond anything they had imagined. A direct path to a championship fight offered publicly, impossible to decline. "I accept," Carlos said into the microphone, his voice clear and strong. The video ends here, but the story continued. Over the next 3 months, Carlos prepared for the biggest fight of his life. The bout sold out in hours. The Philippines declared it a national event. Carlos trained harder than ever, splitting his time between Manila and Norway, building his team, refining his skills. The fight itself, when it happened, lived up to every expectation. It was a 5-round war that showcased the absolute best of both fighters. Magnus's technical brilliance versus Carlos's iron will and heart. In the end, Magnus won by split decision, a controversial result that many felt could have gone either way. But something had changed. Carlos had proven that fighters from the Philippines, from Southeast Asia, from anywhere in the world with the determination to compete, could stand in the cage with the very best. The doors Magnus claimed were closed had been kicked open. In the years that followed, Carlos would eventually win that championship belt, becoming one of the most celebrated Filipino athletes in history. More importantly, a generation of Southeast Asian fighters followed in his footsteps, many citing his confrontation with Magnus as their inspiration. Magnus, to his credit, became one of Carlos's biggest advocates, using his platform to promote opportunities for fighters from developing regions.